Buy now before prices rise is the laziest sentence in this entire genre, because it's usually said about everything at once, with no actual data behind which items deserve it and which don't. 12 foods, checked one at a time against USDA reports, trade filings, and commodity data, and every single one earned its spot on this list for a genuinely different reason. Some because they're cheap right now and won't stay that way. Some because the price hasn't caught up to what's already happening underneath it. Picture 12 carts, each one representing a different reason to act. Some are here because the data says, buy it while it's a bargain. Others are here because the data says, buy it before the gap between today's shelf price and tomorrow's reality finally closes. None of them are here because a thumbnail said so. 12 foods, building from the mildest case to the one with the least room left to wait. Let's start with the one currently having its best year in a long time. Number 12, sugar. What makes sugar worth grabbing right now is a chart that looks almost too dramatic to be real. World raw sugar futures hit 27.31 cents a pound last November. By this April, that same contract had fallen to 14.05 cents, nearly cut in half in 5 months, as Brazil and India both produced far more than expected and flipped the global market from a deficit into genuine surplus. Picture a line chart with a peak in November and a cliff dropping to roughly half that height by spring. That's not exaggeration. That's the actual futures curve. Most people would look at that and assume the whole story is simple. Oversupply, prices fall, stock up, done. Here's the part worth knowing before you do. U.S. domestic sugar production for the coming year is forecast at its lowest level since 2019-20, and a February freeze alone cost Florida's cane crop 75 days of growth. The global price crashed. The domestic supply, making some of what's actually on your shelf, is quietly shrinking at the same time. If sugar is a pantry basic, this is a genuine bargain window. Just one worth using before Brazil's mills potentially redirect more cane toward ethanol instead of sugar later this year, which forecasters are already watching closely. Number 11. Canned tomatoes and tomato paste. Most families would reasonably assume canned tomatoes are caught in the same crisis hammering fresh ones right now. Fresh tomatoes have taken a real hit this year, tariffs near 17% on Mexican imports, freeze damage across Florida, wholesale prices at their highest in a quarter century. It would make sense to brace for the canned aisle to follow. It mostly won't, and that's exactly why this one belongs on a buy with confidence list, rather than a buy before it's too late one. Processing tomatoes, the variety that ends up canned or turned into paste, are largely grown in California's Central Valley on a completely different calendar than the fresh tomatoes getting crushed by tariffs and freezes. An analyst tracking the produce market said plainly that processing tomatoes haven't been affected the way fresh ones have. Picture two supply chains running side by side, one on fire, one completely untouched, both ending up in the same grocery aisle. If your household leans on canned tomatoes for sauces, chili, or soup, this is one of the more reassuring buys on this entire list. Not urgent, just genuinely safe to stock up on without second-guessing the price. Not every grain on this list gets to stay this simple, though. Number 10. Rice, especially domestic long grain. Here's where the buying case gets more specific than most rice coverage bothers to explain. Globally, rice is abundant. India lifted its export restrictions, Asian harvests came in strong, prices are down 35% from the 2023 peak, with U.S. ending stocks at their highest level since 1985/86. If that's the whole story, there's no reason to buy ahead on anything, but American long-grain rice acreage is genuinely shrinking. Arkansas, the country's largest rice-growing state, is cutting acreage to just 900,000 acres, the lowest since 1987. Not from weather, but because persistently low prices and high input costs are pushing farmers to plant less of it. USDA's own forecast has 2026/27 U.S. long grain production down 20% year over year, the lowest total since 2011/12. Picture two bags on the same shelf, one filled from an abundant global supply, one grown by a farmer who might not plant this crop again next year. If domestically grown rice matters to your household, buying a bag or two now, while that specific harvest still exists at scale, is a genuinely reasonable move. Global rice isn't going anywhere. The specific farm growing yours might not be planting it again. Grains aren't the only category running on a delay right now, though. Number 9. Frozen vegetables. Most shoppers assume the freezer case moves independently from the fresh produce aisle right next to it. That assumption is exactly why this one belongs on a buy-ahead list rather than a wait-and-see one. USDA has fresh vegetables up 3.1% in a single month, with 7.8% projected for the full year. Frozen draws from the same fields as fresh, so it eventually absorbs the same pressure. Just later, think of the cold chain as a conveyor belt that started moving 3 months ago, flash freezing at the plant, refrigerated trucking, a freezer case running around the clock in every store. Every stage runs on electricity, and when energy costs move, that cost takes 3 to 6 months to travel the length of that belt before it reaches a shelf price. The bag in your freezer today reflects a decision made months ago, not the pressure that's already loaded onto that belt right now. If frozen vegetables are a household staple, buying a few extra bags this month locks in a price that's standing on borrowed time. Notice something about how these last two items work. The price you see today and the cost actually moving toward it are two different numbers, separated by a few months. That gap is about to widen even further. Number 8. Arabica coffee. At first glance, this looks like the one item on the list where buying now makes the least sense since prices are actually falling. Brazil's 2026/27 crop is projected as high as 75 million bags, the largest global surplus in 6 years, according to several analysts, and prices have dropped for 5 straight weeks to an 18-month low. Picture a line chart sliding steadily downward for over a month straight. On paper, waiting seems like the smarter move. Here's why buying some now, rather than waiting for it to fall further, is still the more data-backed call. Shipping costs tied to the Strait of Hormuz closure are adding real expense to importers and roasters, regardless of what the beans cost at origin. And NOAA is currently putting real odds on El Niño conditions forming later this year. The same pattern that's previously delayed the rains. Brazilian coffee trees need to flower, which decides next year's crop, not this one. This year's harvest is already decided, next year's isn't, and the weather pattern that determines it is still forming right now. If coffee is a daily non-negotiable, this 18-month low is close to the best pricing window you're likely to see before that risk either resolves or doesn't. Number 7. Butter. And here's the cleanest bargain on this entire list. No hidden catch waiting underneath a calm surface, just straightforward oversupply. And it's worth buying into precisely because it's this uncomplicated. Global milk production is up across nearly every major dairy exporting country at once, and butter has taken one of the sharpest hits from that, down roughly 8% in recent trade data, with USDA cutting its own 2026 forecast by 30 cents a pound in a single month. Picture two clocks running at completely different speeds. One belongs to cattle, which take years to rebuild a herd because biology won't be rushed. The other belongs to dairy cows, which can scale up output in months when conditions turn favorable. That single gap in clock speed is the reason this list contains both a genuine bargain and, a few items from now, a genuine multi-year emergency. If there's a single, the data backs stocking up right now, full stop item on this entire list, this is it. Butter freezes for months without real quality loss. And there's no reversal risk sitting underneath this one, the way there is almost everywhere else on this list. Dairy can recover in months. What's coming at the top of this list takes years, and that gap is the whole reason both extremes exist on the same 12-item list. Number 6. Pure honey. This is the one that fooled me a little during the research, because the headline number looks like straightforward relief. U.S. beekeepers lost 55.6% of managed colonies in 2024 to 25. the worst rate since the national survey began in 2010, driven by Varroa mites that had developed resistance to the primary miticide the industry depends on. This year's number, 39.9%. A real improvement. Picture a bar chart with last year's bar nearly reaching the top of the page and this year's bar noticeably shorter. Genuine progress, worth showing exactly as it is. Here's what that chart hides. The president of the American Honey Producers Association put it plainly: losing 40% of colonies in a single year isn't a victory. It's the same crisis running in slow motion. Beekeepers aren't expanding their operations. They're racing to replace what dies every single year, like running on a treadmill that never lets them get ahead. Better than last year's record collapse, still historically fragile underneath. If honey is a pantry regular, this is a reasonable one to buy ahead on now, not because of any immediate spike, but because the supply chain behind it has shown twice in 3 years how quickly a good season can turn into a rough one. This next item is squeezed by something almost nobody expects. Number 5. Canned salmon, especially wild-caught. Here's a distinction worth sitting with. Canned salmon is being squeezed from a direction almost nobody expects, which is regulation, not weather or trade policy. A new federal rule tied to the Marine Mammal Protection Act took effect on the 1st of this year, tightening import requirements around wild-caught seafood. Layer that on top of tightened fishing quotas for wild Pacific salmon, responding to genuine population declines in key fishing regions, and you get a supply pool shrinking from 2 directions at once. Less can legally be caught, and less can be imported without meeting stricter new standards. Picture a door narrowing from both sides at the same time, not because anyone's blocking it deliberately, but because 2 separate rules both tightened in the same year. Industry sourcing data already shows buyers shifting toward farmed salmon as the economics of wild-caught tighten at scale, which matters if the nutritional gap between wild and farmed is something your household actually cares about. If genuinely wild-caught canned salmon matters to you, this is worth buying ahead on now, because the option to buy it at all may narrow faster than the price does. 2 items left before the top 3, and both of them involve a chart that hasn't finished moving yet. Number 4. Cocoa and baking chocolate. Cocoa hit an all-time high above $12,900 a metric ton in December 2024. It's down more than 70% since. Picture a chart with an enormous spike on the left and a long, steep slide taking up most of the rest of the page. One of the sharpest commodity corrections in recent memory, driven by genuinely improved rainfall across Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which together grow over 60% of the world's cocoa. Here's what most people miss about that correction, and why it still belongs on a buy-ahead list despite the good news. A real share of that price drop came from manufacturers using less cocoa, not just more cocoa existing. European grinding fell over 7% year over year. Asian grinding collapsed 16%. That's demand pulling back, not only supply recovering. And underneath the current calm, early surveys for the next West African harvest are already flagging weak pod formation, with the same El Niño risk sitting on the calendar as coffees. Chocolate bars that jumped from $2 to $4 or $5 over the past 2 years aren't reversing, just because the commodity did. That increase is the new baseline regardless of which way cocoa futures move next. If baking cocoa or dark chocolate is a pantry regular, buying it now means buying it before whatever the next harvest report says, rather than after. 3 items remain, and every one of them involves a supply that's thinner than the price tag currently suggests. Number 3. Extra virgin olive oil. Imagine a warehouse that looks completely full from the loading dock, but walk to the back, and 3/4 of it is already empty. That's close to what's actually happening in Spain right now, and it's the strongest buy before the gap closes case on this entire list. The price looks like relief. Spain produces roughly 40% of the world's olive oil. This season's harvest genuinely recovered after 2 brutal years, and prices dropped from an $11 per kilo peak in 2024 to around $7.66 today. A shopper checking that number alone would reasonably conclude this market has settled down. Here's what that shopper can't see. Spanish industry data from May shows nearly 70% of this season's entire production already sold and shipped, an unusually fast sell-through, leaving thinner reserves than expected right as peak summer demand hits. Early field data for next year's crop is already flagging weaker flowering across key growing regions. The warehouse looks calm right up until someone actually checks how much is left in the back. If olive oil is a kitchen staple, this is the item most likely to move without much warning this summer, precisely because the price hasn't caught up to the inventory yet. Buying 2 or 3 bottles now, while the shelf price still reflects last year's calm, is about as close to a documented timing advantage as this entire list gets. 2 items remain, and both involve a mechanism that's already active, not just a forecast. Number 2, eggs. Retail egg prices are down 35.2% year over year as of May, a genuine collapse from the record $6.23 peak down to about $2.19. USDA is projecting continued production growth, and fewer new bird flu detections showed up in the first quarter of this year than during the same stretch last year. Picture a line chart falling off a cliff starting in early 2025 and staying low into this spring. On paper, this is one of the best buying windows checked for this entire list. Here's why the smart move is buying now rather than assuming this holds. New HPAI detections hit 12 states in June, and USDA's own research on this outbreak shows retail prices typically move within 6 to 8 weeks of a depopulation event, a documented lag, not a guess. This exact swing already happened once this year in Pennsylvania. Months of relief reversed by a single outbreak, then recovered once contained. Twice in 1 year, this system has shown it can flip that fast. Think of egg prices like a smoke detector that's quiet right now, sitting in a house where a fire has already started twice in the past 12 months. If eggs are a weekly buy, this is close to the best price window of the past 2 years, and the mechanism that could end that window is already active in a dozen states as this posts. 1 item remains, and its clock runs on a completely different scale than anything else on this list. Number 1, ground beef. Picture a timeline stretching all the way from 1951 to today. The U.S. cattle herd right now, at 86.2 million head, is smaller than it's been at any point across that entire 75-year span, since the year before Eisenhower took office. Every other item on this list has some real path to a good buying window closing and reopening. This one doesn't, and that's exactly why it closes this video. Here's what a shopper actually experiences. The same package costing a little more every single time they come back. Nothing dramatic on any one trip, just a number that keeps climbing. Beef and veal prices are up 12.9% year over year. Wholesale beef is at all-time highs for this point in the season, and USDA's own forecast points to another 7 to 9% increase before the year closes. Picture a line chart that's been climbing for 8 straight years without a single meaningful pullback. No other item on this list has a chart shaped like that. Rebuilding a cattle herd isn't like restocking a warehouse. It's closer to planting an orchard. You don't see the result for years. A calf conceived today needs roughly 9 months of gestation, then 18 to 24 months of growth before it ever reaches a store. Any decision made right now to rebuild doesn't land until 2028 at the earliest. Layer on top of that the U.S. border closure to Mexican cattle imports in May 2025 after a screwworm detection, cutting off a supply line that had accounted for roughly 62% of U.S. cattle imports in prior years. Any calf conceived today doesn't reach your grocery store until 2028. That's the one sentence worth remembering from this entire list, because unlike honey's fragile recovery or olive oil's thin reserves, there's no faster biological path available here, no matter how the rest of this year's data shifts. Buying ground beef in bulk and freezing it isn't a hedge against a maybe. It's a hedge against a chart that's been moving one direction for 8 straight years running. 12 foods, and if there's one thing tying them together, it's that buy now means something different for every single one. Sugar and butter are bargains because the data says they won't stay this cheap. Canned tomatoes are safe to stock with confidence because the crisis everyone assumes is hitting them actually isn't. Frozen vegetables, coffee, cocoa, honey, and canned salmon are all buy-aheads because a cost that's already moving hasn't finished arriving yet. Olive oil and eggs are both sitting on a documented mechanism that could end their current calm inside weeks, not years. And ground beef is the one item on this entire list, with a chart that's been climbing for the better part of a decade with no real turn in sight. That's the actual argument for buying based on data instead of a thumbnail. Not that everything deserves urgency, and not that nothing does. It's that each of these 12 earned its spot for a specific, checkable reason, and knowing which reason applies to which item is what actually determines whether buying now saves you money or just fills a shelf. Which of these 12 hit closest to home for you? Drop it in the comments. I read every one.